My name is Ben Baraga, and this is Chavez Ravine, the Uprooted, a video prepared as part of the class Intro to Chicanx Latinx Histories, History 17CH, at the Claremont Colleges. August 20th, 1957 in Chavez Ravine. A team of sheriffs is attempting to forcibly remove the elderly Mrs. Arechiga from her house while she is gravely sick in bed, dumping all of her possessions onto her front lawn and becoming physical with her children and grandchildren standing in the way. In the scuffle, her 10-year-old granddaughter is kicked by one of the sheriffs, sending her to the hospital. Once again in the American Southwest, Mexican Americans are being forced from their land in order to make way for a modern American society. One thing we have to understand about this modernization in the 1950s is that a Mexican barrio, no matter how important to the history of the people that lived in Los Angeles, could only be seen as a blemish on a city promoting capitalism, booming growth, and good old-fashioned American baseball. Before we can get into the tragedy of Chavez Ravine's destruction, it's important to understand the significance the barrio had to its inhabitants and Mexican-American community. Los Angeles in the 19th and 20th century was a city that owed much of its growth to its immigrant population. Those who crossed the border for work called cities like LA home. The middle-class Anglos living there, however, didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for these newcomers. Communities like Chavez Ravine grew out of undesirable landscapes. The ravine was an old pest farm for people recovering from smallpox. Immigrants fleeing from the Mexican Revolution flocked to the hilly outskirts of LA, looking for work and safety. White city planners had no use for the isolated ravine, for now at least, so that's where the outsiders would stay, swept under the rug of a city trying to save face. Now you might be starting to see a paradox, in which the very people that gave the city its life are simply cast aside in the public eye, like pawns in the ultimate goal of national recognition. This is going to be a key concept. But for now, the citizens of Chavez Ravine had a home, and they worked with what they had. By all accounts, although the town was labeled a quote-unquote slum, the streets were lively, with plants and window boxes. The inhabitants were heartily discontent with their surroundings. The area was known for delinquency and violence, sure, but the gang culture played a strong part in formation of youth identity. Teens were suddenly identifying with their neighborhood and social circles, making LA where they were from, not wherever their parents had migrated from. An elderly woman describes in her account, quote, "Our property is not just a possession. It represents years of labor and privation to provide income property," end quote. These people had built their town from the ground up, and felt no shame in lacking the high-rise buildings of the inner city that began to pop up more and more. Mexican Americans had put their roots back into the land that was pulled out from under their ancestors hardly a century before. Hopefully now you can understand the dismay of the Chavez Ravine residents when they were mailed an eviction notice like this one, even before the news of the ballpark. The initial rationale for the destruction of this sacred town tried its very hardest to act as helpful as possible for all parties involved. It was simply an upgrade to the living environment they were in, and the official notice sent out by the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles reflected this, saying, quote, "If you are eligible for public housing, you will have top priority to move into any of our public housing developments," end quote. But why renovate the living space if the people living there weren't complaining? How could this letter be in good faith towards the inhabitants if it was written by someone with no stake in the lives affected? Richard Neutra, the architect responsible for the new housing development, actually secretly really liked the town's structure and architectural style. The problem only arose in the fact that Chavez Ravine was a quote-unquote slum in the academic sense, and Neutra lacked the courage to overcome that bias. You'll notice that the key paradox has shown itself again. Civic planners decided that it was once again time to modernize, and once again the heart of the city's demographic, the main driver of their culture, did not fit into that plan. Eduardo Obregon Pagan writes in an article published by the Journal of Urban History that, quote, "The envisioned people who staffed and utilized that civic space, the patrons of the arts, and the consumers of local culture were, without question, white," end quote. The Mexican-American Angelenos were only Angelenos when it was convenient for the white middle class, same as 100 years ago when they had to settle out in the hills. These people of Chavez Ravine were objects. Once again, pawns that civic planners moved around on maps, placing and replacing, as if they belonged nowhere. And then, as if the housing plan didn't devalue Mexican-American lives enough, the politics surrounding what to do with Chavez Ravine completely left the now homeless population behind. To give an extremely brief overview of world politics at the time, America had fallen into the paranoia of McCarthyism, which feared communist insurgency into American leadership. Suddenly, this government-funded project of public housing began looking like a symptom of quote-unquote creeping socialism to American citizens, and even the Los Angeles Times. As the city's housing authority, or the CHA, lost favor with the LA government, including a newly elected Mayor Paulson, controversy around Chavez Ravine completely shifted focus to the anti-socialist issue. The question was no longer whether or not the citizens of Chavez Ravine should be allowed the right to their property. It was now whether or not they would have that property replaced at all. Alice Martin, a widow of a World War I veteran, was one resident living in Chavez Ravine that refused to give up the house that she and her husband paid to build. After being begged, bargained, and threatened, she finally received this fraudulent check while away from her house, visiting a sick friend. Her house had been sold against her wishes in her absence, and although she bought it back for a loss, she was sued by the city of Los Angeles and ended up being forced to give up her land. The city of Los Angeles fought tooth and nail against the prospect of losing liberty in their own ranks, but allowed families to be evicted in bad faith from the very neighborhood they built and called home. And for what? Well, for a baseball stadium. For the Chavez Ravine conflict to end in the construction of a baseball stadium fueled by private enterprise seems very appropriate for the narrative of the Chicanx people living in the United States. The city of Los Angeles basically gave the land to Walter O'Malley, owner of the Dodgers, because they knew it would bring status to the now third largest city in the U.S. So, completely cutting out the middleman of the public housing complex, it is clear that both the displacement and the resolution of this housing crisis was fueled by the motive of giving Los Angeles higher status by eradicating its highly concentrated Mexican population from the popular barrio. They couldn't afford to lose the people themselves, but they needed them to be less conspicuous, hence the paradox. And for the most part, their plan worked, as the baseball team seemed to smother the conflict under their American idealism. A PR spokesman for the team was quoted as saying, quote, "The ball club had not even known about the dispute over public housing in the mid and early 1950s, end quote, which is false, but it represents how they were able to force a new chapter onto Los Angeles atop the rubble of Chavez Ravine. With such a diverse and likable ball club, much of the city found it hard not to root for the Dodgers, especially the East LA barrios. Mexican-American heroes like Fernando Valenzuela made the team a bittersweet icon to many barrios in the city. But the memory still stings, and first-hand accounts of the swindling, bulldozing, and threatening are hard to forget. A small group still commemorates Chavez Ravine on where it stood to this day every July. They call themselves Los Desterrados, the Uprooted. So the story of Chavez Ravine is one of perseverance, of making do with your surroundings, and creating one of the most culturally vibrant communities in Los Angeles. Its downfall is a story of white nationalism, under the veil of modernism, trying to get rid of any impure blemishes on the booming big city. Its resolution is one of all too familiar assimilation, which is forced upon immigrants in accordance with good old-fashioned American traditions. They participate along with their fellow Americans. They go to Dodger Stadium and eat a Dodger dog. But the memory of the pain is not to be forgotten anytime soon. Hello, thank you for watching. Here are my sources, and the one in bold is my primary source, so any checks or documents, it came from that. And I hope you learned something. Have a great day.